So we're pretty familiar with the things Benjamin Franklin did later in his life, but let's just start with the beginning. Where was he born? What was his childhood like?
He was born in Boston in 1706. He was the 10th son of a Puritan immigrant. And as the 10th son of a Puritan, if you've studied the Puritans or your Bible, you know you're supposed to be your father's tithe to the Lord. His father was going to send him to Harvard in order to study for the ministry. This was way back when
And
Harvard
so when
knew how
people
to turn out
tithe,
ministry.
I've always imagined tithe as you give 10% of your income. You also
Right.
give 10% away of your, I guess they consider that part of your wealth. Your 10th
Right. Well, it was indeed tithing means giving away 10% of your
Yeah.
wealth. But if you were the 10th son of a Puritan, one of the kids was supposed to be a minister.
I see.
And in this case, it was old Ben Franklin, young Ben Franklin was supposed to be the minister. But he was not exactly cut for the cloth. One day they were salting away the provisions for the winter, and he said to his father, "Why don't I say grace over them now? We get it done with for the entire year. We can, bless
very
the
efficient.
entire
Yeah,
food
instead
and
of every
be
day having
efficient."
to- yeah.
And so I think his father realized that it would be a waste of money to send him to Harvard to study for the ministry. So instead, he apprentices him, makes him become an apprentice to his brother James, who was a printer. He was apprenticed at age 12 to this older brother who was a printer.
I see, at age 12. And that's essentially, I mean, you go do what your brother's doing. This is your education. I mean, back then,
That was the way you got educated, but in return, you were bonded. You were bound to work from age 12 and, usually for, 7, 8 years at least,
Yeah.
for an older brother. And if you've ever had an older brother, this was not something Benjamin Franklin liked after a few years. He rankled over authority. That was one of the ways he was very American. And so he has to decide to teach himself because he's not going to Harvard. He's not in school. His father decided instead to make him an apprentice to the older brother. And so he teaches himself how to be a good writer by pulling down the books from his brother's print shop and publishing house bookshelf. He started off with like Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress and, the essays by Plutarch and Swift and Defoe, all these things you and I were reading at age 12.
Absolutely,
Sal,
yeah.
Right. And then he taught himself how to write. He would take the Spectator magazine, which was a great magazine in London at the time, written by Addison and Steele, and it would arrive by, the post to his brother's print shop, and Franklin would grab it, and he would write down the arguments that Addison and Steele did in their essays, and then he would chop them up with scissors. He would cut them up and put it in a different order, and then try to rewrite the essays in a better order than Addison and Steele had done. This is he's by then 14 or 15 years old. This is really cool. It's like using Khan Academy to teach yourself, but you're using the Spectator from England instead.
And so he becomes, I mean, he actually does start writing then. I guess but his brother didn't really want to.
Right. His brother wouldn't publish him. As I said, he was
Right.
an older brother. And so even though he became a tolerable writer, he can't get his stuff printed in the New England Courant, which is his brother's newspaper. So he has a little trick. He disguises his handwriting, and he makes up a pseudonym. And he writes under a fake name these wonderful essays. He's 16.
What's the name that he uses?
Silence Do Good. These are the Silence Do Good essays. And you're talking about a kid who is age 15 or so making up this character. Now, Silence Do Good was a woman. Now, here, as I say, this is a boy who's a pretty troublesome kid, Ben Franklin. He hangs around the docks in Boston and gets himself in trouble all the time, and he's always cutting work at his brother's print shop. But he invents a character who's a widowed, older woman who is dating a minister and living out in the countryside.
So pretty much the exact opposite of himself.
Right, and it shows something so important in education, which is how do you let the imagination triumph? And here's a kid, 15 years old, who invents this character, Silence Do Good, and just does a pure thing of the imagination. She was indeed the opposite of Ben Franklin, but there are lots of traits that Ben Franklin gave her, and every week she would write about them, that sort of made you realize, okay, it's a bit like Ben Franklin, because she wrote once, I am a mortal enemy to arbitrary government and unlimited power. I'm very jealous for my rights and my liberties. In other words, she's a very spunky woman who has an aversion to tyranny. And it was a great description not only of Ben Franklin, but of the country that Ben Franklin was helping to invent.
And this is, just to give people historical context, this is well before the American Revolution and independence from Great Britain. I mean, we're talking about the early 1700s. We're talking about the period around 1720.
Yeah, we're talking about 50, 60 years before we really are going to have a revolution and break away from England. But already he believes in liberty. He believes in an aversion to tyranny and fighting these things. And you see it in the way that Silence Do Good. Every week she would write an essay until he finally got found out by his brother. He makes fun of the connection between church and state in Massachusetts because the governor, Dunster and Dudley, all these people, they're Puritan ministers who are also the heads of, the governor and the heads of the legislature in Massachusetts. And he says of Governor Dudley, he said, anybody who goes from the clergy into government will take your money in two different ways. They'll do it under the guise of taxes, and then they'll do it under the guise of God, asking you for a donation. And so this little kid pretending to be an elderly woman is making fun of the connection between church and state in Massachusetts. It's the beginning of a free press in America.
And that's a big deal. The church was fairly powerful.
In Boston in particular, as you know, it was settled by the Puritans, yes. And it is a theocratic colony. In other words, Harvard University, the colony of Massachusetts, and the Puritan hierarchy were all the same. I mean, it was all the same people. Cotton Mather and Increase Mather and Governor Dudley, they were the ministers, they were the people who ran the state, they were the people who ran Harvard.
So Silence Do Good, I guess we said she's the opposite. She was maybe demographically the opposite of him, but philosophically.
Right. He's using somebody who's, totally a different type, an elderly woman, to express his own philosophical ideas so he doesn't get caught by his brother.